You are sitting in front of a screen during open enrollment, scrolling through 19 different investment funds for your new 401k, and you stop on the one called Balanced Growth because the name sounds like it was written for someone exactly like you. You click it. You feel a small flicker of competence. Nobody told you what to do. You chose. Except somebody did decide something. Somebody decided which 19 funds would appear on that screen, in that order, with those names out of the thousands of funds that exist in the open market. You did not choose freely that day. You chose from a list another person built for reasons that had very little to do with you. I am going to show you who built that list, what they were paid to build it, and why the real decision was already finished before you ever logged in. The belief feels reasonable, so let it sit for a moment before we touch it. You assume someone with more expertise than you already filled the field on your behalf. Human resources would not knowingly hand you a bad list. The plan administrator has a documented legal duty to act in your interest. The funds on the screen survived some kind of review, some kind of due diligence process, before they were allowed anywhere near your paycheck. That is what the word fiduciary is supposed to mean. So when you pick from the list, you do not experience it as a gamble. You experience it as informed choice inside a system that already did the difficult analytical work for you. That is the quiet logic underneath every curated drop-down menu you have ever filled out for a financial product. Not only retirement funds, but insurance riders, credit card rewards tiers, brokerage starter portfolios, tiered bank accounts. Someone, somewhere, with more time and more expertise than you, curated this list. Curation implies care. There is real comfort in that division of labor, and it is not an irrational comfort. You do not have the hours to evaluate 8,000 mutual funds, compare expense ratios across competing fund families, or read a 40-page prospectus for an insurance bundle between meetings. You trust the shortcut because the alternative is paralysis, and paralysis has its own cost. The menu exists, you assume, to protect you from a market too large for any one person to navigate alone. That is the implicit promise behind every form you have ever filled out under financial pressure and limited time, and it is a promise nobody ever stated directly, because nobody needed to. The architecture did the persuading for them. Here is the first crack, and it is small enough to miss unless you go looking for it. Pull up the fund fact sheet for that balanced growth fund and find one number: the expense ratio, the annual percentage taken regardless of performance. Now leave the plan entirely, go into the open market, and find a fund tracking the same broad index, available to anyone with a brokerage account. Put the two numbers side by side. In a large share of employer retirement plans, the fund sitting on the menu is not the cheapest version of that asset class available anywhere in the market. It is rarely even close. The cheapest version, the one that would compound the most value into your account over 30 years for doing nothing differently, usually is not on the list at all. It was never under consideration. That is strange, if the list exists purely to protect you. A genuinely neutral filter, built only around your outcome, would put the lowest cost option near the top, because cost is one of the few variables proven repeatedly across decades of data to predict long-term returns more reliably than manager skill, market timing, or almost anything else in investing. Instead, the menu tends to draw from a narrower set of fund families, often the same families that pay the plan's record keeper for the right to appear there at all. You were not wrong to trust that some kind of filter existed. You were wrong about what the filter was actually built to optimize. It was not built to find you the single best fund available in the world. It was built to populate a screen with a defensible range of options, satisfying a legal minimum, while generating revenue for the people who assembled the screen in the first place. Those two goals overlap occasionally, by coincidence more than design. They are not the same goal, and the gap between them is where the real story starts. The mechanism has a name. It is called choice architecture, and it did not begin in finance at all. It began with a study most people have heard about secondhand without ever learning its name. A researcher named Sheena Iyengar set up a tasting table inside a grocery store. On one day, shoppers encountered 24 varieties of jam laid out for sampling. On another day, the same table offered only 6. The larger display pulled in more browsers, curious and engaged, stopping to taste. But almost nobody bought. The smaller display pulled in fewer browsers and produced 10 times more purchases. More options did not produce more decisions. More options produced more hesitation, and hesitation, left unresolved, produced inaction. That single finding became a foundation stone for an entire academic field. Behavioral economists Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein built on research like E and formalized the idea that the architecture surrounding a choice, the number of options presented, their order, their labels, their default selection, shapes outcomes nearly as much as the substance of the options themselves. They called the deliberate design of that architecture a nudge, and their framing was optimistic by intent. Use the architecture to help ordinary people make better decisions without restricting their freedom to choose otherwise. The financial industry absorbed the same research and arrived at a different conclusion. If architecture shapes outcomes regardless of the architect's stated intent, then architecture could be built around outcomes that served someone other than the chooser, while still looking, on the surface, indistinguishable from a tool built to help. Retirement plans became one of the earliest and most thorough adopters of this insight, and the reason is structural. A record keeper assembling a 401k menu is not legally required to include every fund available in the market. Under the regulatory framework governing employer retirement plans, the administrator is required to offer a reasonable range of options, document a selection process, and disclose fees somewhere inside a document almost nobody reads start to finish. Reasonable range is a phrase with enormous room inside it. Inside that legal space, the menu itself became a product, sold not to you but to the fund families competing to appear on it. Fund families pay record keepers and plan administrators through arrangements broadly described as revenue sharing, a portion of your expense ratio routed back to the people who run the platform in exchange for placement on the approved list you scroll through during open enrollment. The fund family receives distribution to a captive audience that cannot easily shop elsewhere. The record keeper gets paid twice over, once by your employer for administering the plan, and again by the funds themselves for being included on it. You receive a drop-down menu that presents itself as neutral because nothing in its design discloses any part of this arrangement. The names are clean. The order looks alphabetical or risk-based. The economics underneath are invisible by design, not by accident. The same architecture now governs more of your financial life than retirement accounts alone. Employer health insurance typically arrives as 3 to 5 plan options selected by a broker, compensated through commissions tied to enrollment volume, not compensated by you, and not required to optimize for your specific medical needs. Credit card issuers build rewards programs around airline and hotel partners chosen for the economics of the partnership itself, not for which airline you personally fly most. Bank checking accounts arrive in tiers engineered to nudge balances upward past fee thresholds, structured around the bank's revenue model, rather than any particular customer's actual needs. Brokerage platforms increasingly default new investors into a small set of recommended portfolios that overweight the platform's own in-house funds before they overweight anything chosen purely on merit or performance. There is a second-order effect worth naming here, because it explains why the architecture survives scrutiny even when individual pieces of it get exposed. Each intermediary in the chain can point to a layer above them and argue correctly that they did not design the system, only operated inside it. The plan administrator can point to the record keeper. The record keeper can point to the fund family's bidding for placement. The fund families can point to a regulatory standard that only ever required a reasonable range, never the lowest cost range. Nobody at any single layer holds the entire design in their hands, which means nobody at any single layer experiences themselves as the one responsible for the outcome you eventually discover. The architecture diffuses accountability as efficiently as it diffuses cost, and both diffusions serve the same function. By the time you trace a decision back far enough to find a person who could have chosen differently, that person has retired, changed employers, or genuinely never saw the downstream effect of a contract they signed a decade earlier. In every one of these cases, what looks like your decision is actually the final, visible step in someone else's earlier decision. The decision that determined your real outcome happened months or years before. In a contract negotiation you were never invited to and were never told had taken place. Hold on to that detail. It explains something that will not seem connected to any of this yet. David Okafor enrolled in his employer's 401k in 2010 at 25 years old, in his first marketing job after graduate school. This is an illustrative construction, not a documented case study, built to show how the mechanism plays out across a real-time horizon. The enrollment portal presented him with 19 fund options. He read through the names, selected a target date fund matched to his expected retirement year, and felt, by his own account years later, genuinely proud of the choice. He had not ignored the form the way some of his coworkers had, defaulting into whatever the plan auto-enrolled them into. He had engaged with it. He had read the labels and picked deliberately. For the next 16 years, he contributed 8% of his salary, increased the rate slightly with every promotion, and captured his employer's full match without ever once examining the fund's expense ratio, because nothing inside the enrollment process flagged that number as worth examining. By 2026, at 41 years old, married, the father of 2 children, earning $145,000 a year as a marketing director, he had built a retirement balance he considered solid, confident, in his own words, settled into something that felt finished. The crack opened during an unrelated conversation with a friend who worked in retirement plan administration and mentioned, almost in passing, that revenue-sharing arrangements on actively managed target date funds inside employer plans commonly run between 0.7 and 0.9% annually, while a comparable index-based target date fund available on the open market often runs closer to 0.04%. David did not know which side of that range his own fund fell on. He went home that night and checked the fact sheet for the first time in 16 years. His fund's expense ratio was 0.85%. He sat down with his actual contribution history, not a hypothetical one, and ran the comparison. Across 16 years, the fee differential alone, compounded against the same market returns his actual fund already achieved, cost him an estimated $38,700 in account growth he never saw and never knew was missing. Not because the market underperformed, because he was sized to stay invisible at any single moment, deducted in fractions, too small to notice on a monthly statement, and devastating only when measured across the one-time horizon nobody ever checks. The understanding that landed on him was not about the dollar figure first. It was about the form itself. He realized the 19 funds were never a filtered set of the best options available to him. They were a negotiated set, finalized inside a record-keeping contract years before he was ever hired between his employer's plan committee and a handful of fund families willing to share revenue in exchange for placement. His diligence, reading the names, matching a target date, feeling responsible for engaging with the form, had been entirely real. It had also been irrelevant to the financial outcome, because the outcome had already been decided one layer above the form he was given to fill out. There was no clean resolution waiting for him. Changing the menu itself was not his decision to make. That authority belonged to the employer's plan committee, a small group that reviews record-keeper contracts on a multi-year cycle and rarely revisits them absent a formal complaint or litigation. David could redirect his future contributions into the lowest cost fund still available on his specific menu, which he did, narrowing the gap going forward without closing it. The 16 years already compounded were not recoverable under any version of the decision available to him. He kept the job. He kept contributing at the same rate. He simply stopped believing the drop-down menu had ever been built with his outcome as its primary objective. Picture this scaled across a labor force the size of the one operating inside any large national economy, offered here strictly as illustration of the pattern, not as a documented figure. Tens of millions of workers, each handed a retirement menu, a health insurance menu, a credit card rewards menu, a tiered checking account, each menu narrowed in advance by a negotiation the worker never saw and was never invited into. The aggregate cost is not evenly distributed, and it is not the product of any single actor's malice. A plan administrator is not conspiring against any individual employee by name. A health insurance broker is not personally targeting any one family for harm. Each actor inside the system is responding rationally to the incentives placed directly in front of them, the same way David's record keeper was responding rationally to a compensation structure built and signed years before David ever applied for the job that put him inside its reach. What makes the aggregate effect so durable, so resistant to outrage or awareness campaigns, is that it never required coordination to emerge. No single meeting, no single memo, decided that menus across an entire economy would be narrowed toward higher fee, higher commission options. The pattern emerged independently, industry by industry, wherever a legal structure allowed an intermediary to select options on someone else's behalf while being financially compensated by the very options being selected. Insurance, banking, retirement, brokerage, even the curated investment apps, marketed to a younger generation as simplifying an overwhelming choice landscape, all converged on the same underlying architecture, because the architecture was profitable everywhere it was legally permitted to operate, regardless of which industry it appeared in. Extend the pattern hypothetically into adjacent domains that rarely get discussed alongside retirement accounts at all. Flexible spending and health savings accounts typically restrict eligible providers to a vendor list negotiated by the plan's third-party administrator, a list that can quietly exclude lower-cost options the employee would have chosen on the open market. Auto and homeowners insurance bundling programs default customers into a single carrier's full suite of products, where the convenience of one bill replaces the comparison shopping that would have surfaced a cheaper standalone policy. Even employer-sponsored student loan refinancing benefits, marketed as a perk, frequently route exclusively through one lender chosen for a referral arrangement, rather than for offering the lowest rate available across the full lending market. Each of these, examined individually, looks like a minor convenience. Examined together, they describe a working life surrounded almost entirely by pre-narrowed menus, with the open market functioning as a theoretical backdrop most people never actually reach. The hypothetical total, summed across a full working population over a full career, runs into a figure large enough to fund early retirements, paid off mortgages, fully funded college accounts, for people who never once felt like a decision had been made on their behalf without their knowledge. They felt at every step like they were the ones choosing. That feeling was not an accident or a byproduct. It was the specific output the architecture was engineered to produce, because a chooser who feels ownership over the outcome rarely goes looking for the layer underneath the menu. Redefine the word you have been using carelessly your entire financial life. Choice does not mean selecting from what is presented to you. Choice means having visibility into what was excluded from the presentation and understanding why it was excluded. A menu of 19 funds is not the market. It is a narrow, negotiated slice of the market, dressed in the language of neutrality, designed to feel like the full field even though it represents a small and specifically chosen fraction of it. Real choice would require seeing the entire available field alongside the kralicher used termahuk down to 19, not simply being handed the narrowed result and told it was curated for your benefit. By that stricter definition, almost nobody who has ever filled out a financial enrollment form has made a fully informed choice. They have made a selection inside a boundary someone else drew in advance and then declined to mention. This does not mean every curated list is corrupt or that all intermediaries are extracting value dishonestly. Some menus genuinely are narrowed in good faith, by people optimizing sincerely under real constraints of time and regulation. The distinction is not visible from inside the menu itself, which is precisely the problem the architecture was built around, and precisely why the old question fails you every time. The question worth carrying forward is no longer which option on this list suits me best. The question worth asking consistently, before you ever touch a drop-down, is what was left off this particular list, and who benefited financially from that specific omission. That question does not resolve into a checklist, and it should not. It is a posture, not a procedure, because the architecture adapts faster than any fixed set of steps could keep pace with. What it changes is where your suspicion lives. It used to live inside the decision itself, in the moment of comparing fund A to fund B, plan tier 1 to plan tier 2, certain you were being careful because you were reading carefully. Suspicion belongs one level higher than that, aimed at the boundary of the list itself, at the version of the market you were never shown and were never told existed. You were never careless for picking the wrong fund, the wrong insurance tier, the wrong rewards card. You were responding accurately to information presented inside a frame that was finished and signed before you ever arrived to look at it. The frame itself was the real decision. You were only ever choosing the color of the box it came in. The menu was never the market. It was the edge of what they had already decided you needed to see, drawn long before you sat down to choose anything at all. Next time you are handed a list of financial options, a fund menu, an insurance plan, a rewards card, before you select anything, pause and ask one question out loud. Who built this particular list? And what did they choose to leave off it? Choice architecture is one of the most studied mechanisms in behavioral economics, and the financial industry was an early adopter of it. Every financial product you've ever enrolled in arrived as a curated list. Your 401(k) fund menu, your health insurance options, your credit card rewards program, none of them were the open market. They were a narrowed, negotiated set, built before you ever logged in to choose anything. This episode traces the mechanism known as choice architecture, how it moved from a grocery store jam study into the design of the financial products that shape your retirement, your insurance, and your spending, and who gets paid every time you pick from a list you assumed was built for you.